The 50 Most Famous Artworks by Paul Gauguin. Number 50. Tahitian Pastoral, 1898. Conceived in the fullness of his voluntary exile in Polynesia, Tahitian Pastoral is a testament to Paul Gauguin's desire to capture the harmony between man and nature in a lost paradise. This work, part of his Tahitian period, evokes the serenity of a rural scene that, far from Western mythology, is rooted in the artist's idyllic vision of primitive life. In his desire to break away from the norms imposed by the European academic tradition, Gauguin explores the purity of indigenous existence, depicting a world where time seems suspended. Executed with his characteristic use of flat color and the absence of conventional perspective, the work is dominated by warm, vibrant tones that intensify its dreamlike aura. The balanced and deliberately schematic composition reinforces the sense of a stylized, almost mythical reality. The characters, depicted with a meditative stillness, embody the fusion between the human and the earthy, a recurring idea in the painter's symbology. Today, this painting is housed in the collection of the Musée d'Orsay, where it stands as a bridge between modernity and the ancestral traditions that inspired Gauguin. Its impact resonates in 20th century symbolism, especially in the work of the Fauves, who inherited his bold exploration of color as an expressive vehicle. Number 49. Nevermore, 1897. In Nevermore, Paul Gauguin constructs an image imbued with mystery and evocation, capturing the intimacy and enigmatic melancholy of a Tahitian woman reclining on her bed. The seemingly simple scene contains multiple layers of meaning, linking both to desire and to the looming presence of the unattainable. Inspired by Edgar Allan Poe's poem The Raven, Gauguin introduces the figure of a raven on the windowsill, accentuating the atmosphere of foreboding that runs through the composition. This painting, in which the artist strips the female figure of European conventions, reaffirms his break with the colonialist gaze to propose an aesthetic charged with mysticism and contemplation. The canvas, with a dense texture and material brushstrokes, is enriched by a sober chromaticism in which ochres, violets, and browns dialogue with the warmth of the naked body of the protagonist. The juxtaposition of planes and the construction of the image through blocks of color evoke the influence of Japanese prints, whose impact on Gauguin was decisive. This piece, exhibited at the Courtauld Gallery in London, has had a notable influence on 20th century art, especially on German Expressionism, where the psychological exploration of color and form became one of its main aspects. Number 48. Still Life with Grapefruits, 1901. Towards the end of his life, Gauguin painted Still Life with Grapefruit, a work in which the apparently simple motif conceals a complex interplay of chromatic relationships and meanings. During this period, the artist was in the Marquesas Islands, where his pictorial production became more introspective and refined. The work resumes the tradition of still life, but transforms it into a symphony of shapes and colors that transcend mere objective representation. The grapefruits, arranged on the table with apparent spontaneity, become the protagonists of a scene that suggests a balance between the fullness of life and the imminence of its expiration. In this composition, Gauguin displays his mastery in the construction of planes of color, using a flat background and tones that contrast with the warmth of the fruits. The materiality of the brushstroke, free and expressive, anticipates the path towards a painting that is increasingly independent of visual reality. Today, this piece is part of a private collection, which accentuates its aura of mystery within the artist's legacy. Its influence can be traced in the work of the Nabis and in the evolution of modern art, where color and composition acquired an emancipatory role, moving away from mere recording to become absolute protagonists of pictorial language. Number 47. Food, bananas. 1891. The chromatic exuberance of the meal, bananas, reveals Paul Gauguin's first impact with the landscapes and customs of Tahiti. Created shortly after his arrival on the island, the work embodies the artist's fascination with the purity of primitive life, idealized in his canvases as an untouched paradise in contrast to European modernity. In it, the representation of tropical fruits and human figures in a serene setting suggests natural abundance and the harmonious connection between man and the land, a recurring theme in his Polynesian production. The painting captures the instant of everyday life with a sensorial lyricism, endowing the simplest objects with a symbolic dimension. Gauguin employs his characteristic use of flat color and defined contours, inherited from synthetism, to create a scene in which the pictorial material vibrates with intensity. The warmth of the yellows and ochres contrast with the deep greens, exalting the richness of the vegetation and the vitality of the surroundings. The work is part of the collection of the Musée d'Orsay, where it is exhibited as a testimony to the aesthetic revolution that the painter carried out in his search for the primitive. His influence is perceived in the evolution of modern art, anticipating expressionism and fauvism, whose exponents found in his palette and in his formal simplification a way to liberate color and structure. Number 46. Woman Sewing. 1880. In Woman Sewing, Paul Gauguin is still immersed in his initial phase, influenced by Impressionist realism. The work responds to his life in Paris and his attempts to capture domestic intimacy with an introspective gaze. The scene places us in a serene and silent environment, where the female figure, absorbed in her task, acquires an almost sculptural presence. The composition suggests the contemplation of a fleeting moment, endowed with a lyricism that moves away from academicism to enter a more human and sensitive approach. Through the woman's collected posture and the soft light that surrounds her, Gauguin insinuates an inner world of calm and reflection. The brushstrokes still retain the Impressionist imprint, with a special attention to the modulation of light on the surface. However, certain chromatic decisions can already be perceived that announce his future break with this trend. The work is currently in a private collection, where it remains as a rare example of the period in which the artist was still exploring the conventional paths of European art. Although far from his mature style, Woman Sewing anticipates the search for the essential in his later works and served as a starting point for his transition towards a more personal plastic language, influencing the representation of the female figure in modern painting. Number 45. The Holy Mountain. 1892. After having delved into his stay in Tahiti, Paul Gauguin created The Sacred Mountain, a work in which iconography and mysticism intertwine with the exuberance of the landscape. The mountain, the central element of the composition, takes on an almost totemic character, evoking the cosmogony of the Polynesian peoples. The arrangement of the human figures, some in an attitude of veneration, reinforces the feeling of ancestral rite, placing the spectator in a space where nature and the sacred merge. In this scene, the idea of the Tahitian paradise transcends mere visual representation to become a symbol of spiritual communion. The use of saturated colors and synthetic forms defines the plastic identity of the painting, where chromatic contrasts and geometric stylization accentuate its symbolic charge. The work is preserved in the Pushkin Museum, where it is exhibited as a milestone in the evolution of modern painting. Its impact was notable in movements such as symbolism and expressionism, which took from Gauguin the chromatic audacity and spiritual dimension of art. The notion of the sacred in nature, so present in this work, resonated with later artists, consolidating his legacy as a precursor of a pictorial language that transcends tangible reality. Number 44. Still Life with Japanese Woodcut. 1889. Conceived in a period of artistic experimentation and synthesis, Still Life with Japanese Woodcut emerged at a time when Paul Gauguin was consolidating his break with the European academic tradition. The work embodies the artist's deep fascination with Japanese art, which had become very popular in France following the opening of trade with Japan. Gauguin, who had already explored stylization and the symbolic use of color in Pont-Aven, here incorporates a bold composition that combines everyday objects with a Japanese print in the background, establishing a dialogue between East and West. Technically, the piece is distinguished by its flat application of color and deliberate use of sharp contours, in a clear departure from Renaissance perspective. The dense texture of the oil, worked with short, precise brushstrokes, gives the objects a solid volume without sacrificing the two-dimensionality that he so admired in Japanese art. More than a simple still life, the painting stands as a symbolic exploration of cultural fusion, where each element, from the ceramics to the woodcut background, alludes to the superposition of visual realities. Exhibited in major Gauguin retrospectives, it has served as a reference for 20th-century artists, who found in its approach a path for abstraction and color as emotional expression. Number 43. Two Marquesans. 1902. In the last months of his life, exiled in the Marquesas Islands, Gauguin created Two Marquesans, one of his most enigmatic and synthetic paintings. The work responds to the search for a pure aesthetic, stripped of Western influences, which the artist pursued with fervor during his stay in Polynesia. The two figures, with their serene bodies and absorbed gazes, embody the spirit of a world alien to European modernity, presenting an idealized vision of island life that Gauguin tried to capture until his last days. The oil painting stands out for the sobriety of its palette and the geometric shape, a resource that accentuates the monumentality of the bodies and their connection with the environment. More than a portrait, the work is a visual meditation on stillness and transcendence, where color and composition evoke a latent spirituality. Currently housed in a private collection, the painting has been the subject of numerous studies on the artist's stylistic evolution in his later years, influencing the primitivist imagery of the avant-garde movements of the 20th century, which saw in its formal synthesis a model for the reconfiguration of pictorial language. Number 42. Landscape with Peacocks. 1892. Gauguin's arrival in Tahiti marked the beginning of a period of profound transformation in his work, masterfully reflected in Landscape with Peacocks. This painting encapsulates his fascination with exoticism and the creative freedom he found on the island, where he abandoned any naturalistic pretensions in favor of a deeply subjective vision of the landscape. Peacocks, symbols of beauty and mystery in various traditions, emerge in the scene as guardians of an idyllic world, charged with a latent sensuality that permeates the composition. Gauguin displays a vibrant technique, where intense colors and the superposition of planes blur any notion of rational space. The pictorial material, applied firmly and without concessions to softness, reinforces the sensation of a primeval, almost dreamlike environment. The work, housed in prestigious European collections, has been key in the revaluation of Gauguin as a precursor of modern symbolism. Its influence extends to movements such as Fauvism, where the autonomy of color and formal reduction find a direct antecedent in the bold experimentation that the artist developed in his Polynesian landscapes. Number 41. Landscape in Brittany. 1889. This work comes during a period of great experimentation for Gauguin, when the artist deliberately moved away from realism to embrace a more symbolic and expressive language. During his stay in Pont-Aven, a community of painters in Brittany, he found in the region's landscapes an inexhaustible source of inspiration. His fascination with rural life and Celtic culture is reflected in this scene, where fields and trees take on an almost mystical presence. Here, Gauguin not only documents the geography of Brittany, but transforms nature into an idealized space, in which reality is subordinated to the emotion of color and form. The technique used in this painting moves away from the traditional modeling of light in favor of flat surfaces and intense colors, a fundamental characteristic of the cloisonnism that Gauguin developed with Émile Bernard. The structured brushstrokes and well-defined contours give the work a graphic, almost decorative dimension, reminiscent of Japanese prints. Symbolically, the piece evokes a nostalgic vision of nature, in which the purity of the countryside contrasts with the urban frenzy. This work is currently in a private collection, which limits its access to the public, although its influence has spread widely in modern art, particularly in the work of the Nabis and in the development of Expressionism in the 20th century, where color is seen as a vehicle for pure emotion. Number 40. The Siesta. From 1892 to 1894. Gauguin painted this scene during his first period in Tahiti, when he sought to depict the daily life of the island's inhabitants away from the gaze of European colonialism. Influenced by the serenity and slow pace of life in Polynesia, the artist portrays a group of women reclining in an atmosphere of stillness and rest. The composition conveys a sense of suspended time, where the characters seem immersed in a state of deep contemplation. Far from the exotic idealization with which many Europeans conceived the tropics, Gauguin here offers an intimate vision, in which communion with nature becomes almost tangible. Executed in oil on canvas, the painting stands out for its palette of warm, earthy tones, which reinforce the feeling of warmth and seclusion. The arrangement of the figures and their interaction with the space demonstrate the influence of Egyptian art and relief compositions, while the flat colors and absence of shadows underline the break with traditional Western painting. The symbolism of the work is clear. The siesta is not only a moment of physical rest, but also a symbol of the spiritual calm that Gauguin found in Polynesia. Today, this painting is part of the collection of the Musée d'Orsay in Paris, where it remains a key piece in the exploration of primitivism. Its impact has been considerable on artists such as Henri Matisse and Pablo Picasso, who took up the use of color and the simplification of forms to develop their own aesthetic revolutions. Number 39. Night Café in Arles, Madame Genu. 1888. This painting bears witness to the complex relationship between Gauguin and Vincent van Gogh during their stay in Arles. Madame Genu's café was a frequent meeting point for artists, a space where bohemianism was intertwined with misery and isolation. Unlike Van Gogh's frenetic interpretation of the same place, Gauguin offers a scene of disturbing calm, in which the owner of the establishment appears seated in a distant, almost spectral attitude. Her absent gaze and the rigidity of her posture suggest a state of self-absorption, as if the bustle of the café were unable to reach her. In terms of technique, Gauguin opts for a construction of bold color planes and synthetic drawing that emphasizes the psychology of the character rather than his realistic representation. The lighting in the café takes on a ghostly tone, with greens and yellows that give the scene a sense of unreality. This treatment of space and the human figure prefigures some of the resources that Expressionism would later use. The work is in the Pushkin Museum in Moscow, where it has been the subject of numerous studies on the relationship between Gauguin and Van Gogh. Its influence has been notable in later movements, especially Fauvism and German Expressionism, which saw in this work a precedent for the emotive use of color and formal simplification as a means of psychological expression. Number 38. Woman Holding a Fruit, EU Hair Iao. 1893. Paul Gauguin's move to Tahiti at the end of the 19th century marked a turning point in his artistic production, moving away from European canons to embrace an exotic and deeply spiritual iconography. Woman Holding a Fruit, EU Hair Iao, conceived during this period of immersion in Polynesian culture, embodies his fascination with the primordial purity of the island world. The woman, portrayed in a posture of serene dignity, holds a fruit in both hands, a gesture that transcends the merely everyday to situate itself in the realm of ritual and offering. The composition responds to the formal and chromatic simplification that Gauguin developed in his search for the essential, eliminating superfluous details in favor of a more direct and symbolic expression. Executed in oil on canvas, the work stands out for the intensity of its flat colors and its rhythmic structure, elements that reinforce the sensation of a universe suspended between reality and myth. The fruit that the woman holds, in addition to its possible allusion to original sin, evokes the connection of Tahitian culture with nature and its gifts. The title, which in the Maori language means, "Where are you going?" invites an open reflection on destiny and identity. Currently, this work is in the Pushkin Museum in Moscow, consolidated as a key piece within Post-Impressionist symbolism. Its synthetic aesthetics and poetic charge have left a deep mark on the evolution of modern art, influencing movements such as Expressionism and Primitivist painting of the first half of the 20th century. Number 37. Bathers in Tahiti. 1897. In the last years of his stay in Tahiti, Paul Gauguin achieved the fullness of his pictorial language, distilling in his work a balance between direct observation and symbolic transfiguration. Bathers in Tahiti is one of his most refined compositions, in which the daily life of the island is transformed into a timeless setting, alien to the influence of Western civilization. The scene, seemingly simple, reveals a careful arrangement of figures in space, giving each silhouette a sculptural and organic presence. The work embodies the harmony between human beings and their environment, a recurring theme in the artist's painting, who saw Tahitian culture as a refuge from European materialism. Executed in oil on canvas, the piece is distinguished by its masterful use of color, with a palette that suggests the exuberance of nature without resorting to conventional naturalism. The bodies of the bathers, modeled with soft volumes and precise contours, evoke the plasticity of the Polynesian carvings that so captivated Gauguin. The composition refers to the idyllic scenes of classicism, but stripped of academicism, adopting instead a structure based on two-dimensionality and formal simplification. Housed in the Musée d'Orsay, this work has been an essential reference for avant-garde artists such as Matisse and Picasso, who found in Gauguin's chromatic synthesis and exoticism a path towards liberation from conventional representation. Number 36. Idol with Pearl. 1892. In his fascination with Tahitian cosmogony, Paul Gauguin found in local mythology a vast repertoire of images and symbols with which to reconstruct an alternative vision of art. Idol with a Pearl is one of his most daring explorations in this sense, where the sacred character of Polynesian culture is intertwined with the artist's personal invention. The central figure, with monumental forms and intense colors, seems to embody the essence of an archaic deity, more evoked than represented. The painting does not aspire to ethnographic description, but rather generates a sense of mystery and reverence, emphasizing the role of the spiritual within everyday life. Gauguin, who saw in indigenous religiosity a source of purity in the face of Western decadence, here expresses his ideal of an art that fuses the mythical with the tangible. Oil on canvas, the work is defined by an almost sculptural arrangement of the elements, with an extreme synthesis that gives the idol an imposing presence. The pearl, a tiny but significant point of light, introduces a symbolic counterpoint, suggesting the value of the sacred in the midst of a material world. The use of warm and vibrant tones underlines the atmosphere of enigma, intensifying the impression of an autonomous universe, far removed from Western logic. Today, this piece is part of the collection of the São Paulo Museum of Art, consolidating itself as a key manifestation of Gauguin's visionary exoticism. His influence on surrealism has been notable, particularly in the way in which artists such as Max Ernst and André Masson reinterpreted the concept of the primitive as a source of artistic inspiration. Number 35. Roop Roop, The Fruit Harvest. 1899. The vibrant warmth of Roop Roop reflects Paul Gauguin's deep fascination with life in French Polynesia, a universe that, for him, embodied the purity and authenticity lost in Western modernity. Painted at a time when the artist was completely immersed in Tahitian culture, this work captures the slow pace of island existence, while evoking nostalgia for a paradise that, paradoxically, was never entirely idyllic. Here, Gauguin translates his conception of primitive life into images, imbuing the scene with an almost ritualistic quality, where the harvest becomes an act of communion with the land and its gifts. Executed in oil on canvas, the painting features broad, thick brushstrokes that emphasize the corporeality of the figures and the sensuality of the landscape. Its palette of saturated and contrasting colors, characteristic of Post-Impressionism, gives the composition a dreamlike atmosphere, where the warm tones of the skin merge with the lush ochres and greens of the surroundings. More than just a portrait of rural life, Roop Roop symbolizes the longing for an existence in harmony with nature, a constant theme in Gauguin's work. Currently housed in the Pushkin Museum in Moscow, this piece has had a notable influence on later generations of artists, especially the Fauves, who adopted its bold use of color to endow their creations with unprecedented expressiveness. Number 34. The Call. 1902. In The Call, Paul Gauguin bids farewell to Tahiti with an enigmatic and mystical work, where the interaction between the figures transcends everyday representation to enter the realm of allegory. The scene shows two women standing and a third sitting on the ground, while one of them extends her arm in a gesture that suggests both an order and a revelation. The exact meaning of this exchange remains a matter of speculation, as the artist was known for endowing his compositions with a deliberate ambiguity, typical of his penchant for the symbolic and the dreamlike. The dense texture of the oil on canvas reinforces the monumentality of the figures, which seem to emerge solidly from an enigmatic space, constructed from planes of flat and contrasting color. The formal simplicity, together with the rhythmic arrangement of the elements, recalls the influence of Japanese art and the archaic sculptures that Gauguin so admired. Currently kept in the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, this work prefigures the pictorial syntax of later movements such as German Expressionism, where the power of the image prevails over fidelity to reality. In The Call, Gauguin not only bears witness to his time in Tahiti, but also anticipates the direction of modern painting. Number 33. Annah the Javanese. 1893. Among Paul Gauguin's most intriguing works, Annah the Javanese stands out for its ambiguous character and its atmosphere of strangeness, which departs from the idealized image of the Polynesian woman to portray an exotic beauty in a more enigmatic key. Painted during his stay in Paris after his first trip to Tahiti, the work shows a young woman with oriental features reclining on a divan, her gaze penetrating and her body barely covered by a sarong. Her posture suggests both complacency and veiled reserve, generating a tension that reinforces the psychological charge of the portrait. Gauguin, who sought in the primitive, an alternative to European art, here explores otherness not from tropical exuberance, but from a more intimate and almost introspective nuance. The work, executed in oil on canvas, is characterized by rich impasto brushwork and earthy colors that emphasize the carnal nature of the figure. The choice of dark tones and neutral background contribute to a feeling of seclusion, moving away from the chromatic exuberance of his Tahitian landscapes. Currently in a private collection, Annah the Javanese has been studied for its complex relationship with the tradition of Orientalist portraiture and its role in the evolution of modern art. Its influence can be felt in the later interest of the Expressionists and Surrealists in the representation of the female figure as a territory of desire, mystery, and transgression. Number 32. The Breton Sheep Shepherd, 1886. In The Breton Sheep Shepherd, Paul Gauguin depicts a scene of rural life in French Brittany, a region that attracted him for its apparent purity and connection with the primitive within Europe itself. In this period, the artist shared his time with the painters of the Pont-Aven school, who sought to distance themselves from Parisian modernity and rediscover a more authentic way of life. The work is a testimony of that search, presenting a young peasant woman in a bucolic environment, surrounded by her flock, but endowed with a hieratic presence that elevates her above the simple representation of customs. Gauguin experimented here with a technique in transition. Although the brushstroke still retains traces of Impressionism, his inclination for a more solid compositional structure and a color less dependent on direct observation is already perceived. The earthy and muted tones reinforce the feeling of serenity, while the arrangement of the elements refers to an almost sculptural conception of the figure. The painting is currently on display at the Musée d'Orsay in Paris, where it is considered a key work in the evolution of Gauguin's style before his definitive turn towards synthetism. Its impact is visible in later artists such as Émile Bernard and the Nabis, who took from this piece their interest in simplified figures and flat-colored backgrounds. Number 31. Self-portrait dedicated to Carriere, 1888. During a period of intense experimentation and personal crisis, Paul Gauguin painted this self-portrait with the intention of reaffirming his artistic identity in front of his friend Eugene Carriere. The work, far from being a conventional representation, is inscribed in an almost psychological dimension, where the artist's face emerges with a disturbing intensity. Gauguin, at the crossroads of his break with Impressionism and his foray into symbolism, portrays himself with a penetrating gaze and colors that overflow any attempt at naturalism. The image is not a simple reflection, but a declaration of principles, a pictorial manifesto in which the artist distances himself from European traditions to affirm his own vision of art. The technique used reveals a bold application of color, with firm brushstrokes and marked contrasts that model the face with vibrant energy. The dark, detail-less background concentrates attention on the artist's expression, giving it an almost mystical air. Currently kept at the Musée d'Orsay, this self-portrait has been a point of reference for multiple generations of creators, from the German expressionists to modern painters who found in it a lesson in introspection and stylistic rebellion. Number 30. Clovis Sleeping, 1884. Gauguin's intimate universe is revealed with singular delicacy in Clovis Sleeping, a portrait of his son enveloped in the serenity of sleep. At this point in his career, the artist was at a point of transition, progressively abandoning the Impressionist influence to delve into a painting of more synthesized forms. The composition conveys a feeling of contemplation and purity, with little Clovis immersed in deep rest, his figure enveloped in soft lights that contrast with the sobriety of the surroundings. Beyond the domestic scene, the work suggests a meditation on childhood innocence and vulnerability, anticipating Gauguin's inclination for the representation of the primal and the essential. Executed in oil on canvas, the piece stands out for its looser brushwork and an atmosphere in which color and light construct volumes without the fragmentation characteristic of Impressionism. Exhibited at the Thyssen-Bornemisza Museum, this early work has often been cited as a testimony to Gauguin's stylistic evolution, influencing those artists who, at the end of the 19th century, began to explore new ways of depicting the world of children and family intimacy. Number 29. Breton Girls Dancing, 1888. This work is a vibrant testimony to the profound impact that Paul Gauguin's stay in Brittany, France, had on his artistic development. In 1888, captivated by the authenticity of Breton customs, the painter captured in this piece the innocence and mysticism of a rural tradition that remained intact in the face of the advance of modernity. The rhythmic movement of the young girls, wrapped in an almost ritualistic rhythm, evokes an ancestral world where dance is not only a playful expression, but a manifestation of cultural identity. In this painting, Gauguin employs his characteristic use of intense color and solid planes, eschewing naturalistic conventions in favor of symbolic expressiveness. The figures, arranged in a rhythmic composition, seem to blend with the earth and sky, suggesting a cosmic harmony. The work, now on display at the Musée National des Beaux-Arts in Paris, had a notable influence on 20th-century artists, who found in its treatment of color and formal simplification a starting point for the development of Expressionism and Fauvism. Number 28. The Sunflower Painter, Portrait of Vincent van Gogh, 1888. Few works so vividly encapsulate the complex relationship between two giants of Post-Impressionism as this portrait of Vincent van Gogh, painted by Paul Gauguin during his stay at the Yellow House in Arles. The painting not only captures the Dutch artist's physical appearance, with his absorbed gaze and meditative posture, but also reflects the underlying tension between the two creators. Shrouded in an aura of mystery, Van Gogh's figure is portrayed with broad brushstrokes and dense colors that convey his restless character and almost mystical devotion to art. Gauguin, with his mastery of synthesis, reduces details to the essential, concentrating on the psychological expression of the subject. The work, which is now part of the collection of the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam, is a visual testimony to the crossroads of two divergent but deeply connected artistic visions. Its influence can be seen in the evolution of modern portraiture, particularly in the works of the German Expressionists, who saw in this approach a way of capturing the subjectivity and emotional intensity of human beings. Number 27. The Swineherd, 1888. In this work, Gauguin moves away from thematic grandiloquence to focus on the simplicity of rural life, endowing the scene with a contained poetry that transcends the merely anecdotal. The figure of the swineherd, with his back to the viewer and in harmony with the nature that surrounds him, symbolizes the fusion between man and his environment, a central idea in the artist's search for a primitive and essential expression. This idealized vision of rural life is not accidental, but rather responds to his rejection of the artificiality of industrial society. Technically, The painting is characterized by a balanced composition and the use of vibrant colors that outline simplified forms, in line with his exploration of synthetism. Exhibited at the Musée d'Orsay, the work influenced later generations by demonstrating how painting could dispense with traditional perspective without losing its emotional depth. Artists such as Henri Matisse and the Nabis found in this painting a source of inspiration for their own visual language, reaffirming Gauguin's relevance in redefining modern art. Number 26. Still Life with Three Puppies. 1888. In a transitional period where Paul Gauguin was gradually moving away from Impressionism to consolidate his own artistic language, Still Life with Three Puppies emerges as a testimony to his formal experimentation and his inclination towards visual synthesis. The work captures an intimate moment in which everyday objects coexist with the unexpected presence of small animals, providing the composition with a subtle dynamism. The choice of a still life, a genre traditionally linked to the exploration of light and texture, is here reinterpreted through a vibrant palette and a compositional structure that announces the symbolism that would define his artistic maturity. The work, executed in oil on canvas, is distinguished by its dense and contrasting colors, as well as by the absence of linear perspective, a feature that Gauguin would accentuate in his later works. The arrangement of the elements and the prominence of warm tones not only evoke an enveloping atmosphere, but also suggest a new way of conceiving painting, where optical fidelity gives way to chromatic expressiveness. Currently housed in a private collection, this piece has been exhibited in various retrospectives dedicated to the artist, consolidating his influence on modern painting. His bold use of color and his simplification of forms impacted the Fauves and the Expressionists, who saw in his approach a necessary break with the academic tradition. Number 25. Self-Portrait with Yellow Christ. From 1890 to 1891. On the threshold of his definitive departure from Europe, Paul Gauguin captured in Self-Portrait with Yellow Christ one of his most profound reflections on identity and transcendence. The work was conceived in a moment of isolation and crisis, where the artist confronted his own doubts through a symbolism that fuses his image with that of Christ. The presence of the Yellow Christ, inspired by a Breton relief that Gauguin had already immortalized in another painting, not only reinforces the spiritual dimension of the composition, but also suggests a personal identification with the figure of the martyr, in a kind of pictorial confession where suffering and redemption become central themes. The oil on canvas is characterized by an energetic stroke and a palette dominated by intense yellows and earthy tones, in a clear departure from naturalistic nuances. The two-dimensionality of the representation and the simplification of the volumes reinforce its symbolic charge, anticipating the path that 20th century art would take. Today, the work is in the Musée d'Orsay, where its magnetism has influenced generations of artists. Its radical focus on subjectivity and its fusion of portraiture and allegory had a notable influence on the German Expressionists, who adopted its use of color as a vehicle for emotion. Number 24. Vairumati. 1897. Paul Gauguin's immersion in Tahitian mythology finds one of its most evocative manifestations in Vairumati, where the artist reinterprets the story of the first woman in the Maori tradition through a deeply personal imagery. The female figure, represented with a hieratic and serene presence, embodies the ideal of purity and fertility, essential aspects in the Polynesian worldview. However, beyond its mythological context, the work is also a meditation on femininity and nature, conceived through the prism of exoticism that Gauguin made the axis of his production during his years in Tahiti. Executed in oil on canvas, the painting is distinguished by its intense chromaticism and synthetic composition, where shapes are defined through planes of color and well-marked contours. The contrast between the warm tones of the skin and the dark background accentuates the mystical aura of the figure, immersing it in a timeless space. Vairumati is part of the collection of the Pushkin Museum, where its presence continues to fuel the discussion around Gauguin's vision of the Polynesian world and its impact on later art. Its influence extends to modern and contemporary art, where its fusion between the sacred and the earthly resonates in the exploration of new visual mythologies. Number 23. The White Horse. 1898. In the latter part of his life, Paul Gauguin devoted himself with fervor to the representation of Polynesian exoticism, creating a pictorial language that challenged the norms of his time. The White Horse is a testament to this search for the primal, where the central figure, a steed bathed in light, becomes the bridge between untamed nature and the spirituality of the island. The composition is endowed with an almost mystical calm, in which the human presence is relegated to a secondary role, suggesting the silent communion between the animal and the environment. The work is part of the artist's Tahitian period, when his colors became purer and his forms more simplified, anticipating the abstraction of the 20th century. Executed in oil on canvas, the painting displays a technique that emphasizes the flatness of the colors and the intentional omission of traditional perspective. Gauguin used dense strokes and well-defined contours to intensify the almost dreamlike character of the scene, avoiding the mimetic representation of reality. Beyond the apparent simplicity of the subject, the work contains a strong symbolic charge. The white horse has historically been an emblem of purity and power, but in this Polynesian context it also suggests a link with the sacred. Today, the painting is part of the collection of the Musée d'Orsay in Paris, where it continues to fascinate with its chromatic magnetism. Its influence has extended to multiple generations of modern artists, especially in the Fauvist and Expressionist movements, who found in Gauguin a model of emancipation from academic constraints. Number 22. Under the Pandanus II. 1891. Created shortly after Paul Gauguin's arrival in Tahiti, Under the Pandanus II reflects his first contact with a visual universe that would leave a profound impression on him. Unlike his later works, in which the composition became more symbolic and spiritual, this piece still retains a certain naturalism, albeit filtered through the artist's personal vision. The scene depicts a group of Tahitian women, resting under the protective shade of the pandanus, a tree with long, fibrous leaves that frequently appears in his work. This representation of daily island life suggests a notion of suspended time, where leisure and contemplation take on an almost ritualistic character. Gauguin, with his fervor for the primitive, sought not only to document but also to reinterpret Tahitian culture through his idealized lens. The oil on canvas is characterized by the use of warm, earthy tones, with broad brushstrokes that structure the scene without the need for superfluous details. In this work, Gauguin experiments with the juxtaposition of planes, a visual strategy that eliminates conventional perspective in favor of greater flatness, evoking the aesthetics of the Japanese prints he so admired. The theme is rooted in the myth of the lost paradise, a recurring motif in his work, where nature becomes a refuge and human figures embody a purity that contrasts with the artificiality of the Western world. Today, the work is in the Indianapolis Museum of Art, where it is appreciated as a key piece to understand the evolution of his style. His imprint can be seen in artists such as Matisse and Picasso, who took from him the expressive value of color and the reduction of form to its most vibrant essence. Number 21. The Enchanting Land, Te Nave Nave, Whenua. 1892. At the heart of Gauguin's work is a fascination with the sacred, and the enchanted land is one of its most eloquent manifestations. Created in the early years of his stay in Tahiti, this piece moves away from mere costume-based representation to enter a universe of mythological resonances. The scene, dominated by a young Tahitian woman reclining in a lush environment, exudes a serene sensuality that refers to the original harmony between man and nature. In the artist's vision, the Polynesian island is not just a landscape, but a magical territory, endowed with a spiritual essence that seeps into every pictorial element. The title, in the Maori language, reinforces this idea of a tangible Eden, where the land is both a physical space and a dimension of wonder. In this work, Gauguin displays his mastery of color, deploying an intense palette where greens and yellows overlap in a luminous symphony. The artist's technique, characterized by the use of large chromatic masses with hardly any tonal transition, amplifies the dreamlike sensation. As in many of his paintings from this period, the absence of shadows and the stylization of the figures give the image a timeless, almost iconographic quality. Today, the work is in the Musée d'Orsay in Paris, forming part of one of the most significant collections of Post-Impressionism. Its impact on modern art has been immense, serving as inspiration for the Surrealists and other movements that explored the intersection between the real and the imagined. Number 20. Barbarian Tales. 1902. Created in the last years of his life, Barbarian Tales embodies the exoticism and fascination with Polynesian culture that defined Paul Gauguin's late work. In this painting, the artist, already ill and residing in the Marquesas Islands, transfers to canvas his vision of a primitive and untamed world, captured through intense colors and figures shrouded in an aura of mystery. A twilight atmosphere is perceived, where the female figure in profile and the man with an elusive gaze seem wrapped in a wordless story, an ancestral fable transmitted in images. The scene, although silent, resonates with echoes of local mythology and the artist's own thoughts on Western civilization and its impact on these territories. The work, executed in oil on canvas, displays Gauguin's characteristic post-impressionist technique, with marked brushstrokes and saturated colors that reject realism in favor of expressiveness. The palette of warm, earthy tones gives the scene a sense of the mystical and the alien, underlining the distance between the European vision and the Polynesian reality. Today, Barbarian Tales is in the collection of the Folkwang Museum in Germany, where its presence dialogues with other works of the European avant-garde. Its influence has transcended time, inspiring 20th-century artists such as the German Expressionists, who found in its pictorial language a way to explore the primitive and the subconscious. Number 19. The Loss of Virginity. From the year 1890 to the year 1891. In this work, Paul Gauguin explores the relationship between innocence and transformation through a symbolic representation loaded with meaning. The female figure reclining in a vibrant landscape becomes an enigma. Her naked body, in tension with the serenity of her face, evokes the emotional complexity of sexual awakening. At her feet, a red fox accentuates the ambiguity of the story, introducing an element of danger or cunning that contrasts with the stillness of the scene. The work, painted during the period when Gauguin was searching for his own language beyond Impressionism, reveals his inclination for allegory and pictorial narration through visual codes rooted in the primitive and the instinctive. Executed in oil on canvas, the piece stands out for its use of non-naturalistic colors, a technique the artist employs to intensify the symbolic dimension of the work. The saturated red and blue create a contrast that underlines the psychological tension of the subject. The painting is currently in the National Gallery of Art. Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., where its presence highlights the dialogue between European art and the influence of non-Western cultures. The loss of virginity anticipated key developments in symbolism and expressionism, influencing later movements that explored the psychology of color and formal simplification as a means of accessing the irrational and the spiritual. Number 18. The Moon and the Earth, Hina Te Whatu, 1893. Inspired by the Tahitian myths that captivated Paul Gauguin upon his arrival in Polynesia, The Moon and the Earth, Hina Te Whatu, stands out as one of his most symbolic works, rooted in the local worldview. In this painting, the artist translates into his own visual language the legend of Hina, the moon goddess, and her dialogue with the earth, personified as a male figure. The contrast between the two characters evokes the opposition between the ethereal and the earthly, the eternal and the perishable, reflecting one of the recurring philosophical concerns in Gauguin's work, the struggle between the spiritual and the material. Its composition, with enveloping lines and simplified forms, accentuates the feeling of an archaic story, transmitted through symbols rather than explicit narrative details. Painted in oil on canvas, the work is characterized by its flat surface and expressive use of color, where green and blue tones predominate, evoking the exuberant nature of Tahiti and the mystical connection between its inhabitants and their environment. Today, the piece is part of the collection of the Musée d'Orsay in Paris, a key space for the appreciation of Gauguin's legacy and its impact on modern art. His influence is perceived in the work of artists such as Henri Matisse and the Fauves, who adopted his conception of color as a vehicle of emotion and his search for the primitive as a source of authenticity and artistic purity. Number 17. Woman with a Mango, Vahine no Te Vi, 1892. Upon his arrival in Tahiti, Paul Gauguin sought to capture in his canvases the pure and primal essence of island life, far removed from Western civilization. Woman with Mango, Vahine no Te Vi, is a testament to this search, a work in which the painter captures tropical stillness with a pictorial force that goes beyond simple representation. The model, with her hieratic face and absent gaze, becomes an icon of the exotic, while the ripe mango she gently holds suggests a latent sensuality. This work, created during his first trip to Polynesia, is part of his aesthetic revolution, in which synthesis and flatness of color are opposed to European tradition. Gauguin used oil on canvas, applying a palette rich in ochres, greens, and oranges that dialogue with the exoticism of the natural environment. The technique used, based on defined contours and a subjective perspective, refers to the influence of Cloisonism and Japanism, but with a unique chromatic and emotional intensity. The work not only represents the beauty of the Polynesian woman, but also suggests a symbolic universe where nature and the female figure intertwine in an immutable harmony. Currently, Woman with Mango is in the collection of the Baltimore Museum of Art, where it continues to fascinate viewers and artists. Its composition has influenced later movements such as Fauvism and Expressionism, which found in the simplification of form and the arbitrary use of color a way for the pure expression of emotion. Number 16. Words of the Devil, Peru in the Varua Ino, 1892. In this enigmatic work, Paul Gauguin delves into the mysticism and superstition of Polynesian culture, offering a vision full of ambiguity and symbolism. Words of the Devil, Peru in the Varua Ino, depicts a woman in a state of fear or trance, while a spectral presence emerges in the background, generating an air of eerie spirituality. The work reflects the impact of the Tahitian worldview on the artist's imagination, who interpreted his beliefs through a Western lens, fusing the ancestral with his own vision of mystery. This canvas is not only a reflection of his fascination with the occult, but also a pictorial statement that challenges conventional narratives about spirituality and fear. Executed in oil on canvas, Gauguin employs dark, saturated colors that heighten the drama of the scene. The use of an asymmetrical composition and the reduction of space in favor of two-dimensionality create an atmosphere charged with psychological tension. The title itself, a reference to the word transmitted from the spiritual world, suggests the existence of an unknown voice that resonates in the human consciousness. Words of the Devil is currently in the Indianapolis Museum of Art, where it continues to attract the attention of scholars of symbolism and artistic ethnography. Its bold treatment of mystery and the supernatural influenced the expressionist explorations of the 20th century, opening the door to a painting in which emotion and subjective perception take center stage. Number 15. Madame Moi, Once Upon a Time. 1892. In Madame Moi, Once Upon a Time, Gauguin transports the viewer to an idealized world, a lost paradise where life takes place in harmony with nature. The scene, imbued with an almost mythical stillness, shows a group of Tahitian women engaged in a ritual that evokes ancient times. Inspired by nostalgia for the primitive and his desire to escape European modernity, the painter constructs a timeless vision that borders on myth. The title reinforces this intention by suggesting a legendary tale, as if the canvas were the materialization of a collective memory. Technically, the work stands out for its masterful use of color, with a predominance of vibrant yellows and oranges that flood the landscape, contrasting with the deep greens of the vegetation. The brushwork is loose but precise, giving the figures a monumental, almost sculptural presence. Gauguin reduces traditional perspective to emphasize the flatness of the composition, creating a sense of unreality that reinforces the mythical character of the scene. Madame Moi is currently part of a private collection, and its exhibition has been intermittent, which has not prevented its impact from transcending the history of art. Its conception of the lost paradise has been taken up by multiple artists of the 20th century, from the surrealists to the postmoderns, consolidating its status as an essential work in the evolution of modern art. Number 14. The Market, Tahiti, 1892. This work, inspired by the everyday life of French Polynesia, emerges from the profound impact that Maori culture had on Paul Gauguin after his arrival in Tahiti. With a fascinated eye for the exotic and a vehement desire to get away from Western civilization, the artist took references from both European urban scenes and Egyptian frescoes to represent a group of women lined up in a local market. The rigidity in the arrangement of the figures and their hieratic frontality evoke ancient pharaonic representations, giving the work a ritual solemnity, in contrast with the exuberant nature that frames it. The technique used by Gauguin in this piece is characteristic of his synthetic style: pure, flat colors, well-defined lines, and a reduced perspective that emphasizes the two-dimensionality of the composition. The symbolism of the work is ambiguous, oscillating between admiration for the Tahitian world and the disturbing influence of colonialism. The women in the market, although apparently relaxed, convey a sense of distance and impassivity, as if they were mere shadows of an idealized paradise. Today, this painting is kept at the Kunstmuseum Basel, where it is exhibited as an essential testimony to the modernist longing for a return to primitive purity. Its rhythmic arrangement and reinterpretation of exoticism influenced artists such as Henri Matisse and the German Expressionists, who embraced its simplification of forms and vibrant color palette. Number 13. Fatata te Midi, By the Sea, 1892. Upon arriving in Tahiti, Gauguin found in the relationship between the island's inhabitants and nature an inexhaustible source of inspiration. Fatata Te Midi is one of his first Tahitian works in which he expresses his fascination with naked bodies in communion with the landscape. Two female figures emerge from the undergrowth, walking towards the crystalline waters, suggesting an idyllic harmony between humans and their environment. The composition is reminiscent of classical mythological scenes, but the artist's gaze replaces academic solemnity with a carefree and vibrant sensuality. The brushstrokes are bold, and the chromatic saturation brings the blue of the ocean and the green of the vegetation to an almost unreal intensity, as if the canvas were capturing a dreamlike moment. The warm and luminous atmosphere reinforces the idea of a virgin land, still free from the hand of colonialism. Behind the apparent spontaneity of the painting, Gauguin introduces a play of contrasts: European civilization and the primitive world, culture and nature, nostalgia and idealization. Today, the work is part of the collection of the National Gallery of Art. Gallery of Art in Washington, where he continues to captivate those who seek in his stroke the essence of the wild. His influence resonates in the Post-Impressionist and Fauvist movements, which inherited his vibrant palette and introspective approach to exoticism. Number 12. The Orana Maria, Hail Mary. 1891. Conceived shortly after his arrival in Tahiti, La Orana Maria is a reinterpretation of Christian iconography in a Polynesian key. Gauguin, whose Western education could not be separated from religious symbolism, imagines here a Virgin and Child Jesus enveloped in the colors and gestures of the local culture. The central figures, adorned with colorful sarongs and prostrate on the ground, are presented by an angel with bright yellow wings, a vision that transforms dogma into something tangible, almost earthly. This visual syncretism reflects the clash between imposed Christianity and the ancestral beliefs of the Tahitian people, a recurring theme in the artist's work. The painting's technique is expressive and deliberately primitive. Contours are confidently drawn, colors are arranged in wide, flat fields, and spatial depth is reduced in favor of a more ornamental composition. Every element, from the trees framing the scene to the reverential figures, is imbued with symbolic presence. Today, this painting is in the Musée d'Orsay, where it stands as a manifesto of Gauguin's search for an authentic spirituality, removed from European rationalism. His bold fusion of the religious and the exotic deeply impacted the symbolists and, later, the surrealists, who saw in his visual language a way of transcending the barriers of conventional representation. Number 11. Self-Portrait with Halo and Snake. 1889. Painted at a time of intense spiritual and personal searching, Self-Portrait with Halo and Snake stands as a testament to Paul Gauguin's internal struggle between virtue and temptation. Created after his stay in Pont-Aven, the artist presents his own image as a mystical being, between the sacred and the profane. The snake, a symbol of forbidden knowledge, coils around his hand, evoking the myth of original sin, while the golden halo seems to give him an enlightened character. At this time, Gauguin was moving away from the academic tradition and immersing himself in symbolism, endowing his work with a visual language charged with meaning. Executed with a vibrant and contrasting palette, the work is characterized by the use of flat colors and marked contours, a technique influenced by the Cloisonism of Émile Bernard. His brushstrokes do not seek realistic precision, but rather an expressiveness that accentuates its symbolic charge. Exhibited at the National Museum of Western Art in Tokyo, this piece has become a point of reference for understanding Gauguin's artistic identity. His exploration of self-representation influenced later generations, from the German expressionists to the avant-garde of the 20th century, who found in his work a way to transcend appearance to explore the artist's psyche. Number 10. Two Tahitian Women. 1899. In Two Tahitians, Gauguin portrays the serenity and exotic beauty of life in Polynesia, a universe that he idealized as a refuge from the decadence of Western civilization. Created in his last period in Tahiti, the painting embodies the artist's idyllic vision of primitive life, free of artifice and close to nature. However, beneath the apparent tranquility of the scene, there lies a subtle eroticism and a westernizing gaze that has been the subject of multiple critical interpretations. The duality of the women, one holding flowers while the other observes with an enigmatic expression, suggests a metaphor for desire and innocence, recurring themes in his Polynesian production. The work, executed with loose brushwork and warm colors, is notable for its balanced composition and the sensuality of the figures, in which Gauguin does away with traditional modeling in favor of flat surfaces of color. It is currently in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, where it continues to fascinate the public with its enigmatic simplicity. Its influence can be traced to the work of Henri Matisse and other Fauves, who found in the exaltation of color and the simplification of forms a starting point for the pictorial liberation that would mark the evolution of modern art. Number 9. The Seed of the Aroi, Te no Araa. 1892. The Seed of the Aroi is a key work in Paul Gauguin's Tahitian production, in which he expresses his interpretation of Polynesian mythology with a fusion of the imagined and the real. Inspired by oral accounts of the secret society of the Aroi, a brotherhood of warriors and artists dedicated to the veneration of Oro, the god of love, Gauguin recreates a scene of great symbolic charge. The central figure, a woman with golden skin and an introspective expression, holds a flower as if it carried the very essence of fertility and destiny. At her side, a male figure seems to embody the silent presence of divinity or of the latent desire in the culture that the artist idealized. The canvas is characterized by its use of deep tones and its arrangement of planes of pure color, a resource that Gauguin perfected during his years in Polynesia. The figures have an almost sculptural presence, highlighted by lighting that suggests a world outside of time, between the earthly and the sacred. Currently housed in the Musée d'Orsay in Paris, this work has been fundamental to the development of modern art, influencing artists such as Picasso and the primitivists of the 20th century, who found in Gauguin's stylization a way to break with traditional representation and explore new forms of visual expression. Number 8. The Day of the God, Mahana no Atua. 1894. At the height of his creative maturity, Paul Gauguin conceived Mahana no Atua, a work that encapsulates his search for a spiritual paradise alien to Western civilization. This piece was created during his stay in Tahiti, at a time when the artist, disenchanted with European modernity, was exploring Polynesian myths and rituals with the intention of recovering the primordial purity of art. The scene presents a wooden deity, inspired by Maori sculptures, dominating the composition from the center, while the human characters, distributed in bands of color, seem to articulate a ritualistic narrative. In this canvas, Gauguin does not limit himself to documenting. In his desire for transcendence, he reconstructs a mystical imaginary with dreamlike overtones. The technique employed in this work is oil on canvas, executed in his distinctive cloisonnism, where dark contours and areas of pure color give the scene a sculptural character. The vibrant, unnaturalistic palette evokes the artist's symbolic vision rather than a faithful reproduction of reality. Mahana no Atua is a meditation on the sacred and ritual life, where the central goddess emerges as an immutable presence in the face of ephemeral human existence. Today, This work is part of the collection of the Chicago Art Museum, from where its aesthetic has permeated the evolution of expressionism and symbolism in modern painting, inspiring later artists such as André Derain and Henri Matisse. Number 7. Aroi, 1892. During his second stay in Tahiti, Paul Gauguin conceived Aroi, a manifesto of his idealized vision of Polynesian life, freed from the shackles of industrial progress. This painting captures a moment of serenity in a world that the artist imagined still unchanged, where the harmony between humanity and nature remains intact. The composition stands out for its structure on different planes. In the foreground, two women dressed in colorful sarongs converse in a relaxed manner, while a red dog occupies the center of the image, defying the chromatic conventions of the time. Beyond, a procession of figures enters a green space, as if responding to a mystical call, suggesting a worldview in which the earthly and the divine are intertwined. In this work, Gauguin displays a refined technique based on the use of oil on canvas with intense colors, applied in solid planes and delimited with marked lines, evoking the aesthetics of primitive art. The chromatic saturation gives a dreamlike atmosphere to the scene, in which the symbolism of the dog and the arrangement of the characters refer to a latent spiritual universe. Aroi is in the Musée d'Orsay, in Paris, where his influence on the avant-garde movements of the 20th century was decisive, serving as a reference for movements such as Fauvism, which found in his colors a source of visceral and emotional expression. Number 6. Tahitian Women on the Beach, 1891. Newly arrived in Tahiti, Paul Gauguin captured in Tahitian women on the beach a moment of contemplative calm, far from the hustle and bustle of Western life. This work, which marks the beginning of his immersion in Polynesian exoticism, portrays two young women sitting on the sand, lost in thoughts that seem alien to the viewer's presence. With a gaze that oscillates between melancholy and introspection, the women represent the dichotomy between the placidity of island existence and the latent tension caused by European colonization. The background, defined by the line of the sea and a calm horizon, accentuates the sensation of stillness and absorption, giving the scene an aura of mystery. Oil on canvas allowed Gauguin to experiment with a technique in which the simplification of forms and the juxtaposition of flat colors replaced traditional modeling. The color range, dominated by ochres and blues, gives the work a serene character, while the economy of elements reinforces its meditative quality. Tahitian Women on the Beach is now part of the collection of the Musée d'Orsay, where it stands as a testimony to the artist's transition towards his definitive pictorial language. Its aesthetic has notably influenced artists such as Pablo Picasso and Henri Matisse, who saw in Gauguin's work a way to renew modern art through simplification and expressiveness of color. Number 5. When Will You Get Married? Nafia Faa Poipo, 1892. At a time when the Western gaze idealized the exotic, Paul Gauguin arrived in Tahiti with the ambition of capturing a reality still unexplored by European painting. When Will You Get Married? Is a testament to his fascination with a world that, in his perception, had not yet been corrupted by modernity. In this work, the artist presents two female figures, one in a contemplative position and the other with an inquisitive gesture that questions the viewer, embodying the clash between tradition and change. The painting is not only a reflection of his experience on the island, but also a work that, over time, would become one of the most coveted on the art market. The oil on canvas is defined by its vibrant palette and bold use of color, a hallmark of Post-Impressionism that Gauguin took to its fullest expression. The superposition of flat tones and the absence of mottled shadows reinforce the sense of timelessness and evoke the influence of Japanese art on his work. Beyond the technique, the scene contains a profound symbolic charge. The gesture of the young woman dressed in pink alludes to the tradition of arranged marriages in Tahitian culture, while the presence of the other figure, with her melancholic gaze, seems to embody uncertainty about the future. Today, the work has been part of private collections and prestigious museums, consolidating itself as an icon of modern art. Its influence extends to generations of artists who found in Gauguin's color and formal simplification an inexhaustible source of aesthetic exploration. Number 4. The Spirit of the Dead Watches. 1892. Paul Gauguin's contact with the Tahitian worldview marked a fundamental turning point in his artistic production, evidenced in The Spirit of the Dead Watching. The work was born in a context of anxiety and fascination when, according to the painter's own accounts, he found his young wife, Tahaamana, motionless and terrified in the darkness of her room. Inspired by this scene, he transferred to the canvas a vision that oscillates between reality and dreamlike, evoking an atmosphere of mysticism rooted in local beliefs about the presence of spirits. The work is a testament to his desire to capture not only the daily life of the island, but also its myths and superstitions. The composition stands out for its treatment of color, where the contrasts between yellow and violet create a feeling of unease, intensified by the tense posture of the female figure. The dense brushwork and the use of flat tones refer to the formal simplification that characterized his style, emphasizing the two-dimensionality of space. The specter that rises behind the young woman, dressed in a dark sarong, is a symbol of death in Polynesian tradition, although its interpretation remains open to multiple readings. Exhibited in important museums throughout the 20th century, the work consolidated the exploration of the supernatural in modern art, and its influence can be seen in the symbolism of artists such as Edvard Munch and Emil Nolde, who took fear and anguish to new pictorial dimensions. Number 3. The Yellow Christ. 1889. At the heart of Paul Gauguin's religious symbolism, the Yellow Christ emerges as one of his most enigmatic and personal creations. Inspired by a carved wooden crucifix he found in the Breton region of Pont-Aven, the artist transfigured the traditional image of Christ into an icon of modernity, linked to popular spirituality and beliefs rooted in the folklore of the area. In this reinterpretation, the figure of Jesus is removed from suffering to acquire a static and almost mystical presence, where the intensity of color replaces the drama of expression. The choice of yellow, with its golden and luminous tone, not only reinforces the idea of divinity, but also connects the work with the symbolism of color in Gauguin's thought. By applying a technique of thick contours and flat colors, the painter breaks away from naturalistic representation to create a scene that borders on the visionary. The Breton peasant women surrounding the cross seem indifferent to the sacrifice, as if they perceived it not as a historical fact, but as a constant presence in their daily lives. Currently housed in the Albright Knox Art Gallery, the work had a notable impact on Expressionism, influencing the way in which Christian iconography was reinterpreted by avant-garde artists in the 20th century. Number 2. Vision After the Sermon, Jacob Wrestling with the Angel. 1888. The impact of Paul Gauguin's stay in Breton on his work is powerfully condensed in Vision After the Sermon, a piece in which the fusion of the real and the spiritual breaks with the traditional canons of Western painting. Inspired by the rustic devotion of the peasants of Pont-Aven, Gauguin captures the moment when the women, fresh from church, project their faith into a mystical vision. The composition, Radical in its use of color and in its separation between the earthly and transcendental planes, is an affirmation of the artist's symbolist quest. The work moves away from the prevailing naturalism and gives way to a universe where the perception of the world is filtered by the subjectivity of the spirit. Technically, the painting is a bold exploration of flat, arbitrary colors, with a deep red dominating the scene and stripping the landscape of any pretense of realism. The influence of Japanese printmaking is evident in the arrangement of elements and the absence of traditional perspective, which underlines the two-dimensionality of the canvas. The struggle of Jacob and the angel, depicted in the upper corner, is more than a biblical scene. It is the inner conflict between the mundane and the divine, a struggle that the viewer witnesses from a distance. The work is currently in the National Gallery of Art, New York, USA. Gallery of Scotland, where it stands as a milestone of Post-Impressionism. Its bold use of color and formal simplification would influence the Nabi generation and artists such as Matisse, who found in its symbolism a key to free painting from the shackles of visual mimesis. Number 1. Where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? 1897. Paul Gauguin's greatest work is, without a doubt, Where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? A pictorial testament in which the artist expresses his philosophical vision in a visual narrative of disturbing depth. Painted in Tahiti, where Gauguin sought refuge from the Western world, the scene unfolds in a panoramic format that imitates an archaic frieze, proposing a reading from left to right as the inevitable transition of existence. This work was conceived in a state of anguish, when the artist was facing personal and economic crises, and he considered it his last great declaration before attempting an absolute space. Symbolism is found in every gesture and object. The child figure refers to birth, while the bent old woman alludes to the inevitability of death. The painting, currently housed in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, is one of the most enigmatic of Post-Impressionism and has been a reference for 20th-century artists such as Picasso and Kandinsky, who found in its symbolic charge and in its treatment of color a bridge to abstraction and modern art. Thank you for watching our video. Subscribe to our channel for more videos like this. Give it a like, comment your thoughts, and share this video with your friends and family.